Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, the podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. Dr. Peter Ballerstedt has been a huge influence on many minds and myself personally when it comes to meat sustainability. He uses his expertise in agronomy to offer an interesting counterargument to the claim that ruminant agriculture is destroying the environment. Peter has an extensive background in forage production, utilization, and forage-based livestock production, and was the forage extension specialist at Oregon State University from 1986 until 1992. Peter's personal experience has led him to re-examine the human diet and health. Well, Peter, I'd love to just start with, tell folks a little bit about yourself and your work as a forage agronomist. I think that would just be a helpful introduction.
Okay. So forage sciences are related to producing feed that animals are going to eat. So hay, pasture, silage crops, that all falls under forages. Agronomy is the group, the subject area of things like soil science and crop science and related fields, obviously all within agriculture. I grew up in a suburban environment just outside Philadelphia, but I pretty quickly learned that I much rather liked it out in the country. And finally, ultimately, I was introduced to crop science, which was the first class that I took. And then that just kind of led me through the process that ultimately had me looking at grazing behavior, ingestive behavior in grazing animals, ruminant nutrition, and pasture-based livestock production systems.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And Peter, would love to get your take on just today, there's a lot of misinformation out there and a proliferation of myths around cows, meat, beef, etc. What would you say are some of the problems with how people are getting their information about meat sustainability, including vegan documentaries and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think that as in many controversial topics, that they are usually they're too often reduced or oversimplified, and so we end up without a real understanding of what we're talking about. And then we can layer on top of that different narratives or belief systems or motivations for picking one side or the other. So for me, obviously, I come at this as an agriculturalist. I come at this as a ruminant animal agriculturalist. But from a personal level, a little over 10 years ago, as I say, I was a 52-year-old, balding, obese, pre-diabetic. And, today I'm just balding. I reversed the rest of those conditions, as a result of following a diet that's 180 degrees different from what the mainstream dietary advice is. And so that journey was largely influenced at the beginning by Doctors Michael and Mary Dan Eads' book, Protein Power. But then a year or so after I got started, Gary Taubes' book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, came out. There's been a growth of people speaking in this area. All of that really got me to examine and think about how we could have gotten that so wrong. And as I looked at that more and more, I came to realize that it's a very similar process and very similar people involved in that process that also are the ones that are promoting the story about how livestock agriculture is bad for the environment. It can't feed humanity with livestock agriculture, and then particularly focusing, it seems to me, on ruminant animal agriculture. And so all of that, I began to attend various conferences and, be able to meet some of these people that had such a big impact on my life. And then I would hear things at some of these conferences which I know to not be correct from my experience and my training. And I really wanted to help people avoid the traps of, repeating something that they had heard, but in an area that maybe they haven't spent a lot of time studying in. And so that got me involved in speaking to audiences like low carb conferences and things like that.
Right. That's really interesting. And one thing I love about your messages, Peter, and your talks is you can combine sort of the macro lens of feeding populations, sustainability of a country, of the world, with more micro facts about digestion, ingestion, grain finished versus grass finished meats and their nutrient profiles. So I'd love to start with kind of that wider lens. And one thing you mentioned there is talking about what it takes to feed a growing population. Can you dive a little bit deeper on that?
I think the United Nations predicts that in 32 years we'll have approximately 2 billion more people in the world. That their projections are that will require a doubling of food production that will be accompanied by an increase by about 66% in the demand for animal protein, and that the existing farmland is essentially what we've got to do the job with. There's a number of things that you could push in, back on that. For example, food waste is a huge issue. So if we could get better at not wasting food, maybe we wouldn't need to double food production exactly. But clearly, it's going to require more food, and it's going to require a diet of higher quality. On the other side, the assumptions about what that diet ought to be are very much grounded in what we've been told is a healthy diet. So if we become, maybe more open to the idea that maybe we ought to be eating more animal products, not less, then it's going to be substantially more than 2/3 increase in animal protein. All that being said, how are we going to produce that food? And it's not just an issue of food production. It's distribution, it's storage, it's societal issues. Many, many things go into it. But that's the goal that's in front of us. Now, one side says that the only way we can do that is if we all eat plant-based diets and get rid of livestock agriculture. And any kind of balanced view of the subject will tell someone that that's impossible, that livestock agriculture is itself an essential part of the food security and food production, and in fact societies worldwide. In addition, too often people make overly simplistic to be most charitable statements about competition between livestock and humans for resources. They will misclassify agricultural land as if it's all suitable for cultivation. And then they'll say, look at all the agricultural land that's used to produce livestock. If we just use that for food production, look at how many people we could feed. And the reality is the vast majority of agricultural land is not suitable for cultivation. Yeah. We would cause immense environmental damage if we tried. So there's a number of those sorts of things that you can push at. My area is in the realm of ruminant animal agriculture. And ruminants are those mammals that have multi-compartmented stomachs in which they host this teeming multitude of microorganisms that are responsible for those animals' ability to utilize high fiber, low fat, poor protein quality diets and produce meat and milk and many other products for human use out of grass, out of brushy browse in the case of some species, using crop residues. So, for example, you grow corn, you harvest corn, you're left with corn stalks. They can be fed to livestock, grain that's not suitable for human consumption can and is fed to ruminant animals, vegetable processing waste, for example. So it's frequently not recognized that when you raise a crop, everything that you harvest isn't usable by humans. So what are you going to do with that waste or byproduct material? That's a cost unless you can find some other use for it. And so the ruminants have always been an essential part of the ecological systems in which they live, and they are equally so whether they are domesticated livestock or wild ruminants. And not a lot of people understand the differences, for example, between a beef animal and a pig or a chicken. And they don't understand the difference between the feed that goes into them. And so you find many, many different statements that with a little bit of information, you can see they're not quite what people will say they are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things that shocked me so much about some of the facts you share consistently is the fact about land use, that so much of the world's land is arid and not appropriate for crop use. You can't grow things there. But a lot of times there will be hills, there will be grasslands that can be grazed by ruminant, but not where crops can be grown. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I think the figures are something like 4% of the Earth's surface, and that would include, the 2/3 or so that's ocean. But only 4% of the Earth's total surface is suitable for cultivation.
Yeah. So
compare that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So compare that to the 14% that is rangeland, which is long-term grassland that should not be tilled, plowed, cultivated for production of grain, vegetables, what have you. And then we have an additional 10% or so that's forest land, and we can design and manage systems where grazing animals can be produced in forested and grassland forest mix areas. So you're getting pretty close to a quarter of the Earth's surface that should be involved in some form of ruminant animal agriculture, and only 4% of the Earth's surface that's suitable for cultivation. Yeah,
I love that. And some of these other myths around, percent of land use or percent of emissions, it's so interesting to me how much the metrics can be skewed. Can you talk about some of the common metrics we hear around things like transportation emissions versus cow emissions and the FAO report that was redacted and other things like that?
Sure. You have to make estimates because nobody's doing direct measurements, except recently we're finding, more and more work where you can actually measure from an individual animal, but then of course you have to scale that up. So you're always making assumptions, and you're always, making estimations or guesses. But some years ago, the United Nations, through, I believe, the Food and Agricultural FAO, released a document called Livestock's Long Shadow. And in it, and I believe it wasn't really stated this way in the report itself, but in the, sort of summary at the beginning, which is what most people end up reading, there was a statement about how livestock produce more greenhouse gas emissions than all of transportation in the world. And there were a number of people who found that a hard to believe sort of statement, and some were able to work with the authors and show them that what they had done was they had taken estimates on what's called a life cycle basis or analysis. So if you consider all of the emissions from from livestock agriculture, not just from one particular part of that, but the entire enterprise. They compared it to tailpipe emissions from vehicles. So while they've looked at land use changes as a contributor to the emissions from livestock, for example, they didn't look at, well, what's the greenhouse gas emissions that come from making concrete to make the roads that the transportation runs on, or to mine the metal that then gets made into the automobile so it was a very skewed analysis. The authors admitted that, and another report was subsequently released. So that did two things. One, it reduced the value for livestock worldwide, and it increased the value for transportation. The other thing that has to be said is if you're looking at greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, it's going to look very different if you're in a relatively underdeveloped region of the world compared to one, say, like North America, where you have all the industrial processes and modern sort of services that all contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. For the United States, the EPA estimates that all of agriculture produces 9% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, while transportation is like 28%. And then if you look at just livestock agriculture, that's less than half of agriculture's total, so it's about 4%, maybe a little less. And the beef production just by itself, the beef industry is 2%. So that looks very different from what many people will say. I think it's kind of ironic that the healthcare industry itself can be attributed to producing 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So, if we argue, as I think we could, that eating twice the beef that we're currently eating, if that could reduce the need for the services of the healthcare industry, we might very well be able to say that would end up reducing the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Because even if we doubled greenhouse gas emissions from beef by doubling, consumption, assuming those two are directly related, we'd still only be talking about 4%.
Yeah. It's insane how small the figure is, the impact of ruminants, truly, when you look at the real data and not this strange way of comparing a full life cycle to just one portion of the value chain with transportation.
I did a calculation here very recently, and I've published this. Run it by some people to make sure I did things right. But if you looked at the CO2 equivalents that would come from the equivalent of eating 2 pounds of boneless trimmed beef raw per day, okay, for a year, that would be 10,800 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. Now, that sounds like a lot, but it would be less than what would be produced just from tailpipe emissions of driving less than 17,000 miles per year in a vehicle getting average gas mileage.
Wow. And that doesn't even include making the car and shipping the
No.
parts and all that.
Exactly right. That's, or producing the fuel. I mean, it's only the emissions. So that gives an idea of, this is the topic that people want to talk about, but when you look at it, it sort of becomes really unimpressive, at least to me, especially when, again, part of our argument would be that by eating perhaps this 2 pounds of raw beef equivalent per day, this person might be able to reverse type 2 diabetes and might be able to significantly lessen their risk and burden of a wide range of chronic diseases. And so when we start looking at that, it really doesn't seem like a valid reason for the campaigns that have been launched advocating for meatless behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm with you there. And another myth that's commonly cited is, cows have these cow burps. Some people say cow farts, but I know that's not even true, of methane. And methane is more dangerous for the environment. But I understand it also has a much shorter half-life, so it actually dissipates. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, methane is an interesting subject that does point to how we've learned things as we've gone along, but those new understandings don't always influence or direct the conversation that happens. Yes, methane has a very short half-life. Methane itself is produced from many sources, not just man's activities, and within man's activities, not just from the enteric fermentation, the process taking place in the rumen of any ruminant, whether they're domesticated or wild animals. And yes, it is burps. So all that being said, the methane that a cow is producing is much more related to the cycling of carbon from that which is fixed in photosynthesis, right? CO2, water is fixed via photosynthesis to produce carbohydrate and oxygen. The cow then is, and cow is just one of the many ruminants, but it's the one that I kind of default to because most people are familiar with it in this country. The cow then is primarily a carbohydrate-based diet. And so any carbon that cow then emits is coming from the dry matter that she ingested, which was produced by plants which were grown through the process of photosynthesis. So it's a very direct cycling. Whereas when you look at transportation, that's the use of fossil fuels, which represents an enrichment of the atmosphere with CO2. Now, that being said, CO2 presently is acting as a fertilizer. It enhances plant growth. And that it's not necessarily, there's a lot to be said in that conversation space. And it's important to be understood that I am in no way saying that the climate is not changing, right? But the confident assertion that livestock are a driving force in that, the driving force in that CO2 is the control knob for the climate, I don't think stands up well to a factual analysis. Once again, not saying that climate isn't changing. What I'm saying is I don't think we fully understand everything that impacts climate change. And I would just point to about 20,000 years ago when 5 hours north of where I live, there was about a mile thick layer of ice. And that in the next couple thousand years, there were several dozen catastrophic floods that were released out of the Montana, Idaho area. And those floods dramatically altered the landscape of eastern Washington, formed the soils here in the Willamette Valley where I live. All that happened before we had, they were certainly pre-industrial, let's put it that way. So something happened to significantly change the climate. What was that? And did those processes stop? And I would suggest they probably haven't. They're probably still in play. So I just got done giving a presentation at the Crop Science Society of America, and my point there was to broaden our understanding of the word climate. Climate is not merely temperature and precipitation. It's also policy, it's also regulation, it's politics, it's funding, it's public perception. All of those go into the current climate in its broadest sense. And I think that the biggest game changer that we're facing or that's in front of us today is this idea about what constitutes a healthy diet for humans. And, it's people make confident assertions and they're speaking from well outside the data. But what we do know is we have this epidemic of chronic illness, that these diseases are very plausibly linked to a condition which seems to be amenable to reduced consumption of processed carbohydrates and industrial oils. And if that's true, that's not saying that that's the right diet for everyone, but it certainly is a significant part of the population. 60% of adult Americans today have one or more chronic illnesses. And we're seeing this epidemic emerge in many, many other countries around the world across economic spectra. So then we're left with how are we going to, if that's all true, how are we going to feed an appropriate or provide the food that will be the appropriate diet for those people in a way that protects and maybe even enhances the environment. And the short version of that argument for me is that modern humans exist because of ruminant animals, that modern societies are dependent upon ruminant animal agriculture. And in order to feed the world of 2050, we are going to have to improve the productivity and efficiency of ruminant animal agriculture. Not just in the United States, not just in Europe and North America, but worldwide.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, and I completely agree. I think people are ignoring the real massive epidemic in the world, which is obesity and chronic malnutrition. And by focusing on things like as small as beef's impact on the environment, it's almost ridiculous. And Peter, can you talk with a lot of public figures like Richard Branson, Bill Gates, others have come out supporting lab-grown meat as the answer to all our problems and fixing the environment. Can you talk a bit about problems with sustainability of lab-grown meat?
Yeah, I am on a bit of a self-training exercise to not call that product meat. We missed the mark when we talked about vegetable oils, right? I mean, there's no vegetable involved with that. Why do we call, it's marketing. Because vegetables are supposed to be good for us, right? We're supposed to have 5 a day. So it's not meat. It's, if anything, cell culture protein. Well, meat, the natural product, is not merely protein. Right, so these people that are figuring out how to produce this product, which cut are they emulating? Of what species? Meat is not uniform across all species, let alone across the carcass of any one species. And of course, how you manage those animals, the season that you harvest that animal, all of that impacts meat composition. So how are they deciding what their target composition is going to be? And, the short version is just to mention the word margarine. Right. This is the last, major product that they offered us, assuring us that it would be healthy for us and better and what have you. So there's that. And then you can get into some specifics like where are the raw materials that they need for this process coming from? Because just as cows are not alchemists, neither are they. So they have to be feeding products into that culture in order to get a product out. Where are those inputs and what happens to the byproducts of that process? Where is the energy coming from that is going to be used to drive that process? Okay, so these are just some of the things that occurred to me. One big one, for example, is, there is, I think, rightly concern about concentration of ownership and control of the food system into a few hands. And we're talking about the ultimate in concentration, right? And then ultimately, when you read the announcements promoting this new product, this new technology, they all rely on the flawed, factually incorrect narratives that say that red meat is bad for you and it's bad for the environment. And so when both of those are demonstrably, objectively false, then what's the justification for this new questionable technology?
Yeah, that's a great way you put it. And one thing you talk about, the food-like product, I think that's a great way to describe it. And on the flip side, what's amazing to me is the way cattle, cows specifically, and all ruminants can take what you describe as a low-quality food and turn it into a high-quality food that's perfect for human consumption. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. If we just start with the question of protein, so the protein quality in plant material is lower than from animal products. So plant source foods are about, well, let's put it another way. The animal source foods protein is about 1.4 times the biological value on average as protein from plant source foods. And part of that's got to do with how we calculate protein content in food and foodstuffs and feedstuffs. And so what happens within the rumen is much of the nitrogen-containing material in the feed that they eat is broken down through the activity of the microorganisms that then convert that into microbial protein. They make more of themselves, they grow. And then the cow harvests all of those, or many of them, and digests those microorganisms as part of its diet. And so a ruminant animal has no essential amino acid for the most part. Because they can utilize all the protein and non-protein nitrogen that is utilized by the microorganisms to produce microbial protein that the cow then harvests. It amazes me, but it seems that if you look at a food label and in many food tables, the protein level for a foodstuff for humans is the crude protein value. And the crude protein is not true protein. So if we start off with similar amounts of cooked beef muscle and cooked navy beans, you see a very similar crude protein value. But when you look at the actual amino acid profile, you find that something like 92% of the crude protein in beef is that true protein, while only about 58% of the crude protein in the beans is true protein. And we can't use that non-protein nitrogen. So that basically impacts us significantly because what we think we're getting may not be usable. So that's the protein side, and that's something that the dairy and beef industry has been promoting over the years. But equally important, although perhaps not politically correct in the current marketplace, the lipophobic environment that we live in, the fat content of a cow's ration has to be below 6%. If it's any higher, that fat is toxic to the rumen microorganisms. Okay, so what the rumen microorganisms are doing is they're taking the fiber, which is chemically very similar to things like starch, except that the glucose units that make up fiber are hooked together differently than they are when they're hooked together to make starch. So if you hook them together one way, you make starch or amylose, and we have amylase, the enzyme that breaks that apart, so we can use that directly. The cellulose, which is made up of glucose units hooked together the other way, no vertebrate animal makes cellulase, the enzyme necessary to break those bonds. And so the rumen microorganisms break that. They produce cellulase that breaks down that fiber. They then are able to utilize the glucose from that activity, this anaerobic, oxygen limited environment. They produce short chain volatile fatty acids. Those are absorbed by the host animal through its rumen wall. And so we've put in, let's call it a 5% crude fat diet. And by the time we get through digestion, the cow has gotten 70 to 80% of its energy from volatile fatty acids. So it's converting a low-fat diet into a high-fat diet through this fermentation process. In addition to that, there's various components that are harmful, secondary metabolites, things like that interfere with our digestive system if we eat them directly, but the cow's system is able to take those apart and utilize them as well. And so you have this upcycling of a resource that humanity can't eat, produced on land that can't produce food for our consumption. And from it, we get this highest value foodstuff in the way of meat and milk, as well as many other byproducts, leather, for example.
Yeah, it's so magical how ruminants can do that and produce this high quality food for us out of stuff that just is horrible for human digestion and lacks nutrition. And I find it so interesting, the difference between digestion and ingestion, and that cows can essentially produce this majority of their quote unquote diet as fat, even though they're not consuming fat through their mouths. And I think it also goes against the argument that vegans come up with that, our ancestors, the gorillas, the monkeys are eating, vegetables and grasses and roots all day, but they also have a very different digestion system than us. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. It is interesting to think they're not our ancestors, right? I mean, we go back to a common origin, but there was a little bit of divergence there. And the line that I like is that we didn't evolve to eat meat. We evolved because we ate meat. And that occurred in stages over millennia, obviously. But we exchanged larger guts, which we would need if we were going to get our sustenance by, plant diets. We could, however, live with smaller guts if we ate a higher quality diet. And then the savings, if you will, goes to support a bigger brain, as I know previous guests have described. So that transition is powered by the presence of this richer foodstuff. And I believe it's correct that the 6 existing families of ruminants were essentially present and complete about 20 million years ago.
Wow.
Far predating humanity. So grasses are incredibly old. Took a while for the ruminants to show up to utilize that. Again, there was a significant period of change in the earth. The grasses came to dominate, the ruminants utilizing that resource. And again, they then are themselves a resource that drove our development as a species. So this relationship goes back very, very far. I'd love to go see some of the cave paintings in person. The pictures alone are compelling to see what people tens of thousands of years ago drew, representing, the animals, the food of their day.
Yeah.
And, they don't look that different from what we have today. When we look at plants, of course, there's been a great deal of altering and selective breeding to increase yield, to decrease toxic compounds, to domesticate those plants. So it's one of the things that strikes me. I do like that making the distinction between ingestion and digestion, which puts the lie to the statement of you are what you eat, because clearly a cow is not grass. The truthful statement is you are what your body does with what you eat. And then, the challenge for us is to try to engage with people long enough in the conversation for them to get whatever piece of it they then can take and look at and consider and then take it in whatever direction that they want to go. But for me, as I said, it was that personal transformation that then coupled with what I'd already known, saying, this is this ability to produce food from land that cannot, should not be involved in cultivated, production. And even there are some really exciting things going on where we're reintegrating livestock into cropping systems. The United States over the last several decades has gone down this path where those enterprises have been separated. And so you have commodity agriculture that exists in producing corn or soybeans or canola or whatever, and you don't find livestock being produced on those same properties on the same land. In other parts of the world, you find people, and to some degree it's happening here as well, where the rotations that are being set up will include great animals grazing on some kind of crop that's been planted on that acreage at times outside of the, commodity production. So, after the corn is harvested, maybe they plant something there to cover the soil during the fall and winter and early spring, and at some point in there, they'll run cattle on it to eat again the corn stalks and stover, as well as the cover crop that's been grown. And so we're seeing this kind of be rethought and reintroduced. So it's not, put quotes around, just animal agriculture on the land that we can't grow food on. It's both. And as I said, when we process food crops, we produce a lot of material that would otherwise be a waste product that wouldn't be fed to humans, but we can feed it to livestock to produce food for humans. And so in that way, the systems are integrated as well. And again, too often the conversation tends to be either or, which is just another oversimplification.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you say there about what's the hook for people. And for you, it was improving your own health. But similarly, they can be barriers for everyone. And I think some of the lies and myths we've been told about sustainability and food production are what stand as a barrier to people consuming a higher animal protein diet. So that's why I think part of why I think the work you're doing is so important. And another oversimplification, Peter, that I'd love to talk about is why the word grass-fed might be completely irrelevant.
Well, yeah. So the thought occurred to me just to sum up the last, and that is I want people to put more value on their own health. Right? So we're having this weird conversation in our country where, if I could oversimplify, which I've been talking about not doing, it kind of comes down to, yeah, I know that by eating more animal products and less carbohydrates, you've got a better chance of not losing your toes due to the diabetes that you have. But what about, global warming in 100 years? Really? That's the conversation we're having. Let alone all of the other chronic illnesses that are now plausibly related to hyperinsulinemia. So, I really want people to adopt the idea that when you improve your own health, you are improving the world. So again, put more value on that in the conversation, and maybe force some of the people, not all, but some of the people who are involved in this conversation to admit that they really hate human beings. They really don't look at human beings as having value. They look at them as a scourge on the earth, and they think more of other organisms than they do of human beings.
Yeah, it's some weird ethics.
Yeah, it sounds harsh, but at some point we've got to kind of get that out into the open so that people can recognize that, we're not having the conversation that we too frequently think we are. So back to grass-fed, grass-finished. The majority of feed is for animals, food is for people. The majority of the feed that all ruminants in the world consume is non-edible by humans. So now you can call it whatever you want. A large amount of that's going to be grass, but grass technically is one group of plants. So are you going to count alfalfa and clover in that? Are you going to count small grain that aren't grown for grain in that? Or are you going to count vegetables, wastes, and other forage crops? For example, we can grow beets or turnips that we intend for an animal to eat. So is that still grass-fed? So how technical do you want to get? But even in the United States, less than 10% of the lifetime feed that a typical commercial steer finished in a feedlot is going to consume, less than 10% of its lifetime feed is grain. So I want people to understand that the vast majority of feed that these animals are consuming is grass. The first 3/4 of an animal's life, even if it's finished in a feedlot, is going to be on pasture. That's how they're raised. And so you're talking about comparing two different finishing systems, and for 3/4 of it, it's going to be exactly the same for an animal that is grass finished versus grain finished. And again, they're not just fed grain, as we just established. So all of that, just to make sure that we're understanding what we're talking about, then what is it that we hope to be achieving, right, by going one to the other? I am really impressed by the argument that Ivor Cummins and Ted Naiman and many others make on this relationship between chronically elevated insulin and virtually every chronic disease you can name. And I use the analogy from crop science of soil fertility of Liebig's barrel. So imagine Justus von Liebig was one of the very early organic chemists. He did many things, one of which was in plant nutrition. So he came up with this example, so we give him credit for it. Imagine a wooden wine or rain barrel. So you've got staves that make up the barrel, and these wooden staves are of different length. So the amount of wine or water that barrel is going to hold is going to be determined by the shortest stave. Yes? So if you don't know which one that is, you can waste money at best and maybe even create toxicities and problems if you just go applying fertilizer, for example, without knowing what the limiting nutrient is. So let's say that phosphorus is limiting in one particular situation. We add some phosphorus fertilizer, and now that stave is increased, but now something else, one of the other staves is now the shortest one, so it's limiting. So it doesn't make any sense to add any more phosphorus, right, until you've then adjust. So you're constantly doing this kind of adjustment and reevaluation. So I use that analogy in public health, saying it's the chronically elevated insulin that's the short stave. And until we've accounted for that and addressed it, we really don't have much chance of knowing what the effects of these other factors that are undoubtedly there, they always are, but the strength of that one signal is so large that it's going to overwhelm any signal that you could possibly be getting from one of these others. So we could talk about it as a Pareto principle, and that's the 80% we need to look at first. So we have all of this evidence from people who've been dealing with human beings, making dietary adjustments, seeing positive benefits, and none of them have to do with grass-fed meat or organic whatever. Those options didn't exist for them, right?
That's right.
So you can look at Pennington, you can look at Atkins, you can look at Eads, you can look at any of the others that have done this work. That wasn't part of the deal. Well, if it's not part of the deal, what right do we have to tell people that it must be this or that? You got to spend more than maybe you're going to be able to afford. That creates stress. What about, the label claims and all this that get us into trouble to begin with? So there are differences between truly grass-finished beef and conventionally finished beef. That's undeniable. what I'm not convinced of are the biological significances of those differences. And part of what makes me so suspicious is if you go back into the literature and you look for the first sort of papers appearing on this, they were all latching onto this idea that saturated fat is bad for you, that, the fish oils are good for you. So what can we do to increase the omega-3 content, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of these, at least to my understanding and my filters, are kind of more related to the misunderstanding of what was producing heart disease than anything else. And so it's really become a bit of an obsession with me as I look through the literature and see how many times I come across these, associated with heart disease, whatever. And it's like, what's it going to take to clean up our literature in the agricultural realm, in my little part of it, from all the stuff that, we've been subjected to for now almost half a century.
That's right. Insulin really is the long pole in the tent. And you make a great point about focusing on that. And one of the things I think I can credit you with, Peter, is bringing, and it may not lend itself as well to audio, but you have this great slide in your presentation showing, breaking down the myth about omega-3 to omega-6, fatty acids between quote unquote grass finished and grain finished beef, and showing that the difference is negligible when you compare it to any amount of vegetable oils, pork, or chicken in the diet. And as soon as you have even one serving of pork, one meal of chicken, or any vegetable oils or walnuts even, it completely erodes any advantage in omega-6s that you would have had from switching from grain finished to grass finished. Or the other way around, excuse me. So, I'd encourage folks to check that out. And another thing.
Thank you.
And another thing that, folks talk about, and I've heard people say, Scott, aren't you worried about, all the hormones in, conventionally raised beef? Can you talk a little bit about that as well, Peter?
Yeah, the short version is, in those situations where they use exogenous hormone implants, the amount of additional hormone you're going to get in the meat from those animals is negligible. It is on the order of, I think the figures are something like 3 nanograms per 3 ounce or 4 ounce serving. From a non-implanted steer versus 4 nanograms. So 1 nanogram difference. Now, what has to be, and that's multiple orders of magnitude less than you would get from an egg or from butter, or let alone from any product containing soy or other plants, which, yes, it's phytoestrogen, but it still can have an effect on human beings. So that really isn't an issue just from the magnitude of what you're consuming versus what a normal human being produces on a typical day. Just to kind of cycle back to the last topic, I do have a paper from 2009, so almost 10 years ago, saying that we should no longer be using ratios between omega-6 and omega-3 for defining risk of heart disease. I mean, that was put to bed a while ago. Part of the reason is, as you mentioned, that it's a matter of content, not relative ratio. And then the other part to all that, and I find it interesting, that because we got launched onto the whole idea of fish oil was an explanation for how you could have yet one more population that ate a lot of fat but had very little heart disease, and that literally was the case. Rather than re-examine the hypothesis that maybe fat doesn't cause heart disease, we have to find some explanation for why that's still true, so they came on the fish oil. because we went down the fish oil trail, and oh yes, there was a fish oil industry that benefited from all that, we are now locked into only looking at two long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA. Well, because that's all that fish has. But mammals produce three forms. There's EPA, DHA, and a DPA. All of them have importance and function, and we're beginning to understand more about DPA, but it's not considered in any of the regulation and labeling requirements. The irony, though, is that the people that they were saying were getting all this benefit from the fish oil that they ate, their largest source of fat in their diet was not from fish, it was from marine mammals. So, wrong on several occasions, and here we are. And so then you have to also look at how the vegetable sources of some omega-3 fatty acids are counted as if they are equivalent to the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, which we need. And we have limited ability to convert from the plant source to the animal source. And then the omega-6, which from plants is problematic at best. The longer form from animal products, arachidonic acid, has benefits, but it's counted as omega-6, when you look at ratios. So in many ways, that whole thing is hopelessly confounded. And then at the end, there's no information in the marketplace to help people. There's just these confident assertions about, well, it's higher here than here. But if you look at the published literature, it varies so tremendously between the cuts in any one carcass, between breeds of animals, between sex of animals, between the season of the year. And again, there's no information to tell somebody, well, if I'm buying it now, it's this, right? So why are we subjecting people to this kind of information when there's no application for it? And then all the other reasons that I've talked about already. So there are all of these. How did Adele Height says that Americans love the idea of saving the world by shopping. In part because it keeps us from really having to do anything. Right. So we just, okay, if I buy this, I can feel good because of the claimed benefit one way or the other of this product versus that product. And we've been told for so long that we shouldn't eat red meat, but we really like eating red meat. So if you can tell us that there's a form of red meat that we could eat and feel better about it, double winner. Well, but when you go and you start looking at these claims, they really do not stand up well to scrutiny. So the, no hormones, well, you'll see that on pork, you'll see that on poultry. What people need to know is there's been no exogenous of hormones in pork and poultry production in the United States for many years now. That we've already mentioned very small differences that exist in beef, and the fact that there are larger sources of estrogenic compounds in the diet coming from other places that nobody's worried about. Another concern is exposure to pesticide residues. My comment to people is that there's substantial surveillance practices where samples are collected, rapid screenings are run. If residues turn up that are above some predetermined level, then that carcass or that batch of milk or whatever it is quarantined. It's more closely examined, and if it's shown to be problematic, it does not enter into the human food chain. And then they find out where that problem came from, and somebody's facing a large fine and problems. So there's a lot of, and that stands for antibiotic residue, it stands for pesticide residue. But what's interesting is if you wanted to lower your exposure to pesticides, what you probably ought to be doing is not eating plant matter. Because I think it was Dr. Ames said something like 99.99% by weight of the pesticides that we're exposed to in our diet are natural compounds coming from plants that plants don't want to get eaten.
Yeah.
Unless it's the fruit which they want eaten, so the seeds are distributed. But for leaves and roots and stems, they typically want those to not be consumed, so they produce compounds to make themselves less attractive for herbivores. Herbivores over time have evolved the ability to deal with those compounds. We haven't, and so this concern about exposure, when I think what he said was something like only 50 some of those compounds have been tested in rodent models. We don't test them because they're natural compounds, and all the regulation is written for the compounds that are created, as or man-created pesticides. But these natural pesticides, when they've been, a small number that have been tested, well over half of them have been shown to be rodent carcinogens. Now, I'm not saying that we should therefore be, panicked about them. There's lots of problems with the rodent carcinogen model, but it is to say that people don't understand that. Either when they hear about exposure from a synthetic pesticide, or when they think that by buying, organic vegetables, they're not being exposed to pesticides. So there's a lot of what I've discovered in all this is that there's many different sides to this, and people typically don't know of much of it. So in that way, I want people to feel that they can go to whatever supermarket is in their neighborhood and within their means and buy the products that are appropriate to, their traditions and their experience and within their means, and eat those products and feel confident in their safety. And if they are sort of with us on this journey of restricted carbohydrate, ketogenic, carnivory, wherever they are on that continuum, that the animal products that they can buy in their local supermarket are not the thing to be worried about. What they should be worried about are all those processed plant products that they should no longer be consuming.
Yeah, it's just another great example of people latching on to oversimplification and common metrics, which can be really deceiving and based on incomplete facts at best. And Peter, another area I'd love to touch on is ethics. People, and not asking you to get philosophical here, but just thinking about both in terms of deaths and treatment. How sort of conventional beef raising compares to monocropping and other animal raising, chickens and pork.
Yeah, it's important for people to recognize what it takes to produce a commodity crop or a vegetable crop or what have you. That represents a far greater impact on the environment than grazing rangeland or cultivated pastures. So that's, again, as you said, people typically only look at the one animal that's slaughtered in the case of beef, and they don't look at what happens to soil life or wildlife in areas that are, clean tilled for the production of some of these human utilizable, plant crops. I do try to get people to realize that in many of these operations, and I'm thinking of, cattle operations, cow-calf operations, these are multi-generational operations. Most of them privately owned, family-owned businesses. They've been in the same place for a significant period of time. As I said, sometimes multiple generations on the same piece of land. They have a concern for the environment and for the animals that have been, the product of not just their life's work, but that of their parents, grandparents. You get the idea. They have a tremendous concern for the welfare of their animals. Now, people who have some foundational belief about not killing animals may have a hard time understanding that. And I don't really want to get in any position of telling them that they have to do anything. But if their position is based on their concern for their environment or their concern for human health and well-being or their concern for the animal's well-being, then I would assure them that those concerns are not well-founded. And so then you're left with what your personal belief is based on something else. And again, that's a personal thing. I don't want to get involved in that. But it's hard for me to listen to conversations about ethics from a point of view that so frequently is based on falsehoods, whether those are, whether the people are sincerely wrong, in other words, they truly believe what they're saying, but they're wrong, or in some cases, deliberate deceptions and falsehoods. Have a hard time, equating ethics with that. So, the animals that we consume, if they were free living, would have a different quality of life than they are given under, appropriate care and stewardship. Again, it's difficult for people to look at that. But one of my eye-opening moments was when I got to hear a presentation from someone from Tanzania who was working with small dairy farmers. And these were primarily women, and they, might have 3, if they were a really good farmer, dairy cows. And they practiced confinement dairying because if they did not, then their cows became food for the wildlife. So it's like, oh, okay, that's a different way to look at it.
Yeah.
So one way to look at it is, I think this is right. I heard this and I'm not sure I could go find it easily, but I know I could find it. Something like 1.5 billion people in the world would like to have animal products but can't afford it. Yeah. Another way to put it is that like 5% of the world's vegetarians are by choice. The rest are out of this economic necessity. So part of the bigger picture, is saying how, as we said toward the beginning, of how do we, what's it going to take for this kind of food to become affordable, available, accessible, deployable, all those sorts of terms, which are beyond the mere, forage agronomy 101 and animal science 101 kind of issues. A very complicated thing, which is why it's kind of exciting. As I mentioned at this national crop science conference that I was just at, somebody from, I'm assuming, Brazil said, but animal products are expensive. And I said, yes, they are, which is why we need to be looking at what it's going to take to make these more affordable. But at the same time, one of the advantages of carbohydrates is they're shelf stable, right? Right? You can walk into any small store anywhere, doesn't need refrigeration. You can grab it off the shelf and eat it on the go, right? Now, we can talk about whether that's right or not, whether that's good or not, but that's a reality. And so what would it take to produce, I would say beef jerky, but that tends to be a very lean product. So now what kind of cured meat can we produce that will be shelf stable without refrigeration, right? That, could enable people to access the animal fat and protein and, oh, by the way, the vitamins and minerals that are provided in animal products in a superior way to what we get from plants. So, we look at Spam and go, ooh, but wait a minute, it's shelf stable, right? It's there in the can. So I've become very interested in what we can do around the world to promote ruminant animal agriculture. And there we see the same taint of the nonsense that we've been subjected to for 50 years. One publication from an organization called ILRI, I-L-R-I, International Livestock Research Institute, which is in Ethiopia. And a lot of what they do is, small ruminants, sheep and goats. And so here's this document saying all of the positive impacts of livestock agriculture around the world, and they're significant. And then you've got this sort of little black box kind of thing, obligatory, the risks of overconsumption. Right? You'll get fat, you'll get heart disease, you'll get diabetes, right? And oh, by the way, you'll burn up the world. And it's like, what's it going to take for us to purge that? Just look at the health claims, right? We can deal with the greenhouse gas emissions separately, okay? But just look at the health. There's no justification anymore for people talking about the saturated fat. Well, sorry, I get distracted and a little bit wrought. We have just had this story come out about a modeling exercise that was looking for the optimal tax level to place on meat. Right? Did you see that story?
Yeah, frightening.
Yeah. And what's their basis? Well, it's going to reduce disease burden and healthcare costs. Wait a minute. There is no longer any justification for people talking about the meat consumption and tying it to, public disease crisis. That just should not be part of the conversation anymore, but it still is. So what's it going to take to get rid of that? And I started a conversation, I hope, to get people to look at it. Is there any data, is there any evidence to show that the consumption of red meat or even processed meat in the absence is associated with chronic disease in the absence of the consumption of processed carbohydrate and or vegetable oils or industrial oils? And so far people are telling me I haven't found any. And then do we have evidence of those same chronic diseases showing up in populations that don't eat meat? And the answer is yes, we do. Do we have any plausible association or causal relationship between the consumption of refined carbohydrate and or industrial oils and these very same chronic diseases? And the answer is yes, we do. So how can you justify in a journal article, which these news stories are based on, a paper that takes as its basic assumption that the consumption of meat is something that in and of itself is the producer of chronic disease? It's remarkable to me. And so it's not just the affluent West. It happens throughout the world. The rest of the world would love to have more animal product. And in some parts of the world, they get the animal products, but they do it by decimating wildlife. So that's another side that people don't frequently think about, right? So all of this is part of what animates me. So I'm glad to have the opportunity for the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise, Peter. And you bring such interesting perspectives. I think people are oftentimes really myopic, and you just have such a great broad lens of everything going on. And, you know, all over the world, people trying to find access to high quality animal protein, being wrought with diseases of metabolic function. And meanwhile, people are focused on these sensationalist headlines and incorrect metrics. So it's really important to question some of that.
Yeah, and it's not, I don't know. Sometimes the words I use aren't as well considered as they could be. And I understand why people, believe what they believe. I mean, if what people believe about commercial meat production and meat quality and safety were in fact true, I'd be worried about it. Right? I mean, you hear this story, it's like, oh my goodness, that can't be good. But it's not true. So how do we communicate that? And then we've got the reality that we in North America are something like at least 3 generations on average removed from the reality of what life on a farm meant 3 generations ago, let alone what it means today. Yeah. There's been a lot of change, right? We can talk about all that, but too often people really, they're coming from a perspective that really isn't all that reflective of what the reality is. I heard a presenter say that the average American today is more likely to have direct personal experience with the criminal justice system than with production agriculture.
Yeah.
So I made sure I wrote that down because that was a good one. And then before I used it, I went looking for data to support it because, and the best I could do is find statistics from Department of Justice and Department of Agriculture. And I think it's like 2012 kind of statistics. At that time, I think we had like 2.2 million people locked up, local, state, federal. We're not talking about parole. We're not talking about probation. We're talking about locked up, 2.2 million. USDA counted in their Census of Agriculture 2.1 million as primary operators of farms. So, you'd have people working on the farm, whatever. But all it takes to be a farm in their survey is sell $1,000 worth of goods from your property. That's not net. That's gross sales.
It's a low bar.
Yeah, it's a good hobby, and I'm all for it. But it's not, making a living. In fact, when you drill into that data a little deeper, you see that 70% of that 2.1 million made less than 25% of their household income from the farm. So very few people are making a living, right? The majority of their household income from farming in the United States. Now, another quote that I heard is something about, people who come from farms tend not to go back, right? They talk about it, they dream about it, whatever, but they don't do it for the most part. And the end of that quote was, they know better. Right. I mean, the reality, romance is great so long as you don't confuse it with reality. Right. And So that's part of, I think, why we can be in the position we're in now. But even, so part of my job is to kind of stand between my tribes and try to introduce them to each other. The farming community believes a lot of the standard narrative about, well, if people were only more active, right? Everything in moderation, or any number of things. And it's always interesting to me to see what pushback I get from different audiences, right? It's just because sometimes I think, oh, I'm in friendly company, and then I'm getting smacked by something. It's like, wow, okay, I assume too much here. So it's understandable why people can come to believe the things that they believe. Our challenge is to become effective communicators. And I really think that the personal dietary adventure is a great way for most people to approach this whole subject, because it's really kind of hard for many people to kind of embrace just how wrong dietary policy has been in the United States, just how poorly we've been served by people we believe are experts. And certainly as I've gone down this path, it's opened my eyes to the influence of nonprofits, of various interest groups that have had an impact in how we've gotten to where we are, and they're still part of the conversation, but most people don't recognize them for what they are. So I say that the American Heart Association is not a patient advocacy group, right? It's a trade organization, and there's nothing wrong with that, unless you confuse the two. And one of the last slides I showed this week at the national conference was, and I was with a lot of people who have done some really good science within their realm, and trying to get them to understand just what a mess the human nutrition and human health realm is. And so I have a picture, and you've got or a slide, and it's got 4 pictures on it. You've got a human dietitian and an animal nutritionist, and you've got a medical doctor and a veterinarian, right? And the simple point is that the animal nutritionist and the veterinarian can answer questions that the human nutritionist and the medical physician can never ask, right? Because there are ethics involved here. You can't do those kinds of experiments, right? It's just not possible. And so that may explain how we've made such tremendous advancements in animal agriculture, for example. And yet we've gone arguably backwards in human health because we just haven't been able to get the same kind of studies done and the same kind of answers. I think the figures are something like, well, I know this is true. We are producing, I think it's something like 70% less resources to produce beef today than in 1970.
Wow.
Less land, less water, less emissions, right? So if your interest is environmental impact, then there's a good story. One rancher put it this way. He said, our animals have never been healthier, and we've never been sicker.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think you're doing excellent work, Peter, spreading this message and really digging into the science and some of the stories around nutrition, pairing those together with the meat and sustainability and forage agronomy story, and just talking all about how ruminants rule. So
thank you.
Where can folks find out more about you and grass-based health?
You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at grass-based, one word. You can find grass-based health Facebook page. I have a blog by the same name. So you can also find me on YouTube. I have a channel there with a number of my talks as well as other videos that I find interesting, and I'm trying to get them filed into sensible categories. I get interested in various topics, and so other people might find that interesting. So you can just look for my name, Peter Ballerstedt. And in my talks, I also at the end give contact information, and people can feel free to email me at peter.ballerstedt@gmail.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Peter. Really appreciate your time, and look forward to sharing this with folks.
Thank you, Scott, for the opportunity. Thanks for what you're doing, and enjoy good health. Remember, a steak a day keeps the doctor away.
That's right. That's right. You too. Have a good one, Peter.
You too.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out, and share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore or research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.